Well, now, I continue to be Jon Atack, and I'm delighted to welcome Alexander Barnes-Ross. Hi, Alex.
Hi, how's it going, John?
It's going very well generally, but a little busy, as always. And I imagine it is for you too. Um, you've been doing some sterling work, and I want to applaud that publicly.
Thank you.
It's really important that somebody gets in there and deals with these things. And I just can't manage with everything else that goes on now. Not anymore. I'm an old man now, retiring and being on charitable boards and things like that, as old people are, I suppose. You've made great progress in dealing with the political situation in the UK. We've talked both about Diane Abbott, and for those who don't know, Diane Abbott is a long-standing member of Parliament in the Labour Party in this country. Very outspoken, well known for being frank and forthright in her views. Something of a television celebrity as well over the years. So you've managed to bring her to the cause. And we also want to talk a little bit about John Sweeney. But if you could tell me something about Diane Abbott and what's happened with her, I'd be grateful.
Yeah, so back in, it must have been September or so, I emailed my local MP, who just so happens to be Diane Abbott, and just said, hi, what can you do as my local MP to support? This is my story. This is what Scientology are up to. This is what's happened since I started speaking out. And I just want to know what you can do, or what services you can point me in the direction of, like just asking for general advice. And then it took a while for her to get back to me, but eventually I got a letter from her, not from her secretary or assistant or anything. It was her signed, letter from her saying, not just thank you for getting in touch, but I have already contacted HMRC, which is the tax office here in the UK, the IRS of the UK, and requested they investigate Scientology's finances for fraud. And she completely denounced fair game and harassment and all of this. And she said no one should have to put up with that sort of activity or harassment when someone leaves a supposedly religious organization. So I was already shocked that she didn't just offer advice, she'd already taken action. And that kind of started the ball rolling. So I've met with her a handful of times, and her secretary and her team. Obviously, there is a lot of change going on in the political landscape at the moment, but she's a really good ally to have. Diane Abbott is the most abused member of parliament in the UK. If you look at, I think it was Amnesty International did an investigation a couple of years ago and found that I think it's 50% of all online harassment and abuse that are directed towards female MPs, 50% of it is directed specifically at Diane Abbott herself. She was the first Black female member of parliament in British history. She has dealt with a lot of harassment and a lot of rubbish, to not use too many expletives. So she's actually quite well positioned in terms of dealing with fair game, because she knows how to handle it, and she's not afraid to take on bullies and take a stand. So I'm just lucky that she's my MP.
Yeah, that's amazing. I've been very impressed with her over the years. She used to do a TV show with Michael Portillo, who was a Tory MP, was on the other side. And it was nice to see and I had no particular thing for him before that. He was not somebody I respected. But seeing the two of them actually having open discussion, which is so unusual now. It's more usual seeing people with megaphones yelling abuse at each other politically now, which is awful. As you say, we are in a time of transition. We have a general election for those outside the UK, I don't know, in July. And it seems extraordinarily likely that we'll have a Labour government. And it's also very likely that Diane Abbott will have a cabinet position within that government. So she is a very powerful ally. Same time, you let me know that John Sweeney is standing for Parliament as a Liberal Democrat, and part of his platform is an investigation of Scientology. And for anybody who doesn't know, John Sweeney is a television reporter, a war correspondent, who some years ago added to his fame with the exploding tomato video, as he described it to me, where he was making a documentary about Scientology, and they, of course, were filming him as he was filming them, filming him, filming them, and he blew up the Scientologist involved in, haranguing him at all points. He finally lost it and did the "No, Tommy" response, for which he became famous. He subsequently wrote this is a guy who's been in Korea and seen hard times, but Scientology really managed to get under his skin, so much so that he wrote a book and is now seeking to stand for Parliament with the idea of saying something about Scientology and the gains it's made. You perhaps know a bit more about this than I do, because that's all I know.
Yeah, so when I first met John Sweeney last year, he's a really, really great guy. And we went for a beer, and it was quite funny actually, because there was a time when I was working for Scientology London and offered John Sweeney a stress test and got in a lot of trouble for it.
A lot of stress.
So yeah, the moment I offered him a stress test, I realized who it was and ran back to my superiors and was like, I've just offered John Sweeney a stress test. What have I done? What? And they'll like, tell you what happened. And yeah, that was the whole thing. So when I met up with John, I was like, hey, so I have to apologize, because last time I met you, we were standing on Edgware Road and I offered you a stress test. And he was like, I remember that. And I said, I have to apologize because I went away thinking that you were the devil. You're the most evil person on planet Earth. And I had the most horrible opinion of you. And he was like, Alex, it's fine. What beer do you want? So he's a great guy. We laughed it off, and we kind of talked about how interesting it was that what would have been once two enemies are now sat having a drink and, friends. And so that was a nice little cathartic moment. But he did let me know that when the next general election happens, he will likely be standing as a Liberal Democrat MP. And so when the general election was called the other week, I contacted him and I said, hey, John, congratulations. And that's amazing. And, I want to write something about you running in the constituency of Sutton Coldfield. Are you going to do anything about Scientology if you were to be successful? And he sent me a statement that he said I could publish, and I'll read it to you. It's only very short. He said, for far too long, Britain's political establishment has given the Church of Scientology an easy ride. It is a church that blackmails and brainwashes its young adepts. Its Hollywood stars are treated like gods rather than ambassadors for a kind of mafia organization that wears the mask of religion. If elected, I would hold a debate condemning the church's abuse of young and vulnerable people in the UK and around the world. So I think that's great. And that means as we're recording this, the only candidate standing in the election who has publicly pledged to debate Scientology if they're successful is John Sweeney.
Yeah. And standing actually in the constituency next, the one into which I was born, which is literally.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Sutton Coldfield, 15 miles away. Well, let's hope that he's successful. It is important. It's bizarre, looking back at the history of Scientology, that there have been a number of members of Parliament in Holland, in Denmark, and in the UK. Sonny Bono was a senator in the US. So there have been politicians who are Scientologists. And there was a great furore in starting in Victorian Australia with Kevin Victor Anderson's inquiry into Scientology. And I'm kind of equivocal about what happened there, because I think they made Scientology attractive by condemning it. And I think it became, so in fact, what happened was that if you look back to about 1963, there are perhaps 500 Scientologists in the world at that time, maybe 1,000. By the time all the inquiries were over, which was 1971 with the UK inquiry, John Foster, there were about 25,000 Scientologists. So it had this unfortunate ripple effect. And by making it look sinister, so when the Australian journalist Alexander Mitchell in 1969 proved that Hubbard had been involved with Aleister Crowley's sex magic, that actually got more recruits. I talked with people over the years who'd actually got into Scientology because they went, oh, it's another form of Aleister Crowley's sex magic, which it isn't. There is no sex in Scientology, so it's not worth joining. Just want everybody to know that. No, and there's nothing magical about it, that's for sure. So I think it's important that this be an even and proper discussion. And I think, you know, John Sweeney and Diane Abbott, two people, are perfectly capable of that, looking at what's actually happening, what's really wrong, and not attracting people in a kind of tabloid newspaper way, which is what happened in the 60s.
I mean, I think, you know, I don't know enough about that time period to assess whether it was just a coincidence or not, because if you look at things like the Leah Remini's show, The Aftermath, and well, you know, there is a lot of evidence out there that Scientology has shrunk massively as a result of large press and sort of attention on this issue. So I don't know enough about that time period specifically, but I do think it's important to differentiate the debate between the so-called religious beliefs and the treatment and abuse of vulnerable people, right? And that's what I try and do with my activism. Is I try really hard to kind of say, look, Scientology as a belief system is one thing, and, you know, I've got my views on it, and I think ultimately the belief system is harmful in and of itself. However, that opinion is separate to the activism work that I'm doing, which is focusing specifically on the abuse. It's saying you can believe in what you want. I don't care if you want to believe in Xenu and OT3 and all of this stuff. Like, be my guest. I'm not the person who has the right or the ability to tell you what you can and can't believe in. But what you can't do is abuse people, lock people in rooms, you know, put people in the hole, throw people into the lake at St. Hill, force people to have abortions, and all this other horrible stuff we hear about. That abuse is what needs to stop. And that's what I'm trying to do here in the UK, is get people who can make decisions about this sort of stuff to look at the way they are treating humans, not to review their religious belief system, because that's a whole separate topic. And yes, that needs to be done, in my opinion. But I think the first step is looking at the abuse and the way that they're treating people.
Yeah, that absolutely is the first circle to get through. I would say, I mean, I've never really got deeply into any debate about whether Scientology is or isn't a religion. It was not considered a religion when I belonged to it. I remember, I left in '83. I remember having conversations with Americans who were not meant to be in this country under law, studying Scientology under the Aliens Act, which was finally withdrawn in '81, I think. But they explained to me that they'd become ministers of the Church of Scientology so that they wouldn't have to go to Vietnam. They didn't become ministers of the Church of Scientology because it was their religion. The ministers' course took them 1 week to do, and they were then certified and didn't have to go to Vietnam. And there was an actual program that I was told about in all of the US orgs, the organizations, where everybody took the minister's course so you wouldn't get sent to Vietnam. And the religious pretensions come out of that. Hugh Urban, in his very interesting book, Church of Scientology, A New Religious Movement, the only thing wrong with the book is the title, because you get to about page 210 and he says it isn't actually a religious movement. So it should be called the Church of Scientology, not a new religious movement. Because, as he points out, what it's done is made a kind of simulacrum of religion. It's pretended, it's looked at what you're meant to do and then adopted those ideas so it'd be treated that way. As you know, Hubbard first brought the subject up. There's a letter of the 10th of April 1953 to the head of the Hubbard Association of Scientologists, Helen O'Brien, where he says, what do you think of the religion angle? And that's the first time it's mentioned. And then in December that year, contrary to his later statements, he actually files in Camden, New Jersey, he files 3 religions, 3 churches: the Church of American Science, the Church of Human Engineering, we'll get to that one, and the Church of Scientology. He would later claim it was Burton Farber in California the following February who first registered a Church of Scientology. It's not true. I have the registrations. So he was very keen on this. And what he says in his letter in 1953 is, we can make more money by doing this. And as we know, the governing policy of Scientology is make money, make more money, make others produce so as to make even more money. And it really is the governing policy, and that's the title of it under Hubbard. So the religious question is, for me, if somebody believes in the flying spaghetti monster and they want to call themselves a Pastafarian, I'm fine with that. I don't have a problem. I think religion is something that somebody chooses for themselves, and that the state, as under the American Constitution, shouldn't make any determinations about religion. However, underneath the layer of abuse, the things that you've talked about, there is the practice of Scientology itself. And from a psychological perspective, Scientology is an implanting system in Hubbard's terms. It's a way of bringing people to believe things which are palpably untrue. It's a way of bending people's minds and enslaving them psychologically. So I think it's also high time for an investigation of therapeutic methods. It's been asked for repeatedly in this country over the last 4 decades. That there be some, in the US, before you can hang out your shingle and say you're a counselor, you have to have a master's degree. In this country, you just have to be able to order some fries at McDonald's. That's about the basic qualification. Yeah. And it is a situation where there are a lot of charlatans, but there's nothing really much worse than Scientology, which is bringing you to believe abject nonsense as if it were true. Worse yet is that it erodes compassion in people. It makes people narcissistic and selfish. The first dynamic comes first sort of thing. And even, down to no sympathy, that the idea that sympathy is an emotional thing. It's a type of emotion to have sympathy for somebody that belongs somewhere down around pain, which is also, according to Hubbard, an emotion, which I don't think is true either. That we should not be sympathetic, that we should not have empathy, that we should not have compassion. And if you think about a thought reform system, and Scientology is undoubtedly the most elaborate thought reform system ever devised. So where a system like transcendental meditation, and I have many criticisms of that, there are various videos about that on my channel with people who are long-term members and high-ranking members of transcendental meditation. They have 2 techniques. Scientology has more than 2,000. And by the time you're done, you don't know which end is up. Yeah. So it's psychologically abusive as well.
Yeah, and I think that's the point that I said a second ago about the practice of Scientology being harmful in and of itself. That's my belief. I agree with everything you just said, but I think with the activism, a lot of people, particularly politicians and lawmakers and all of this, get really scared, especially in the US, because there's a constitution and the separation between church and the state. Like, it's hard for a decision maker to be able to make a decision on whether something is a religious belief system or not, and therefore to judge whether it's harmful or not. It's a very difficult thing to navigate. And in the UK, obviously, it's different. But for me, I've found that a lot of people are kind of scared to make a statement on Scientology because, is it a religion? Is it not a religion? Is it protected by the Equality Act or is it not? I don't know. And so that's why my starting point is, okay, let's not look at I'm not saying not look at it, but let's not make a statement on the belief system. Let's just look at the way it's treating people, fair game, harassing its critics, locking people in rooms and performing sec checks, right? And meaning you can't leave until you've confessed to all of your crimes, forcing people to do hard manual labor as punishment. If you're in the Sea organization and you work at St. Hill, you're not allowed to leave the property without permission or without a buddy and without good reason. You work for long hours, 7 days a week with no time off for very little pay. Irrespective of the belief system, do you think that's okay? regardless of whether it's religious or not. Is that an okay way to treat a person? And I think that's the way I'm approaching the activism to begin with, to get that debate going so that people start looking at the way this organization is behaving. And hopefully that then paves the way for people to then look at, okay, well, actually, is that part of a belief system, or is it the way that it's being applied or whatever? And when people find out that the way they're treating humans is because of their belief system, that's what Scientology dictates you to do, then hopefully that opens the door to looking at the wider harm that is created by practicing Scientology as a whole. But like I said, the first step, I think, is looking at that abuse.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. If people want to believe, as Scientologists do, that the Venus and Mars are both inhabited, the fourth and fifth invader forces. Now, Mars is vaguely possible, and we're hoping to send Elon Musk there very soon. But Venus has a median temperature of about 400 degrees centigrade. So the idea that there are beings there who might invade us at any moment, which is it's part of the sacred scripture of Scientology. But people want to believe that the Earth's flat and Venus is populated. Doesn't bother me at all. But I think there's something between the physical abuse that you talk of, which absolutely should be highlighted, but there is coercive control. And that also is, at the moment, the law in this country brought in 2015 only relates to intimate relationship. But once you've admitted that one person can psychologically dominate another, you have to expand that outward from intimate relationship and look at exploitative persuasion as it is deliberately practiced. So I would say, absolutely, we need to alert people to all of the abuses, but the more subtle abuse, which is not actually about the beliefs. These are hypnotic practices. Yeah. And it's something that, many Scientologists, there is a phobia induced about certain things. You mustn't talk about the brain because it's just a switchboard and it doesn't do anything. You mustn't read about the brain. It's not relevant. Psychiatrists are all out to destroy everybody. Any word that begins psych means somebody who's after, a conspiracy to destroy all life by using roast perfume, if you believe Ron Hubbard. But let's not get into the absolute craziness of it. But I have a friend who is is looking to do a PhD on the concept of freedom of mind. And he wants this enshrined by the United Nations. He wants not just freedom of thought, but freedom of mind. And I think we've missed that with Scientologists, the hypnotism and hypnosis, the state that hypnotism brings about, they are invisible, because Hubbard early on was saying every auditor must study hypnotism. It's right there. It's in the sacred scriptures. He recommends books. Hypnotism Comes of Age by Wolf and Rosenthal, which is very interesting when you look at what's going on in there and what he applied. I wrote a paper called Never Believe a Hypnotist, which is just quotations from Hubbard, where he says things like, hypnotism was never used in research. All of our research was based on hypnotism. In the same text, he's, in Dianetics, Modern Science and Mental Health, he's saying these kind of things. And so we find ourselves with a system of hypnotism, a way of controlling other people's minds, implanting thoughts, suggestions into their minds, getting them to behave in a certain way. When Conway and Siegelman, who came up with the idea of information disease in the early 80s, they wrote the book Snapping and updated it in the 90s. They're communications experts, psychologists. And they said Scientology may have the most elaborate set of destructive rituals in the United States, having studied all sorts of cults, and that where somebody would walk out of the Krishnas or the Moonies, and in 3 to 6 months, they'd be, back to life again. They estimated it would take 12 and a half years unaided with Scientology. That was back in the 90s. I wrote to them in 2014 and said, that was a guess, wasn't it? It was an estimate. Would you agree with me that unaided, most people will never recover from Scientology? So people think they've left, but the software is still running until you've challenged those beliefs, that animosity towards enemies, that lack of compassion. Until you challenge these ideas, they'll keep running. So the Scientologist will say, well, I believe what goes around comes around. I believe in karma, or karma vipaka, if we want to get into the Sanskrit. It's not the overt motivator sequence anymore. I don't believe in past lives anymore. I now believe in reincarnation. And they haven't gone and looked at these ideas. They haven't thought about it. Now, I don't mind people believing in karma. I think it's ridiculous nonsense personally, because mathematically it's not possible, because once the universe has started and there's been a cause and an effect, there will be no free will. There will be no decision making. Everything will just unpack automatically. And if a giant clam has, I'm told, 2,000 million little clamlets, every one of them is tracked in the Akashic records, the book of karma, everything that happens to them, and integrating them all, there could be no choice or decision for any of us if that were true. So I reject it as an idea. But people want to believe it, that's fine. But go and look at the Buddhist and Hindu ideas. Don't just carry on with the Ron Hubbard ideas, which are not very deeply considered. Ron Hubbard was not a great student of metaphysics. His references are usually to kind of the boy's own book of, whatever, rather than a deep meditation upon things. If you want to believe in reincarnation, in Scientology, you've got this weird idea, and it's possibly why the suicide rate in Scientology, by my estimates, I did work on this in 1993, by my estimates, the suicide rate in Scientology is 10 times higher than the average in the US and the UK, 10 times higher, because people get to this point where they go, oh, I'll do it in my next life. And so they don't value life. Well, as coming from a Buddhist background, what shocked me in Scientology was that nobody seemed to realize that reincarnation is considered a bad thing in Buddhism and Hinduism. It's called the fear of the eternal return. You're trying to get off the wheel of suffering. You're trying to stop existing, which I'm not into. I think existing is great and I want to keep doing it as long as possible. But in Scientology, it's this kind of hippie, new age attitude. Oh, I'll do it in my next life. No. So before carrying on, I think all of us have to consider what we do believe. And with Scientology, it's a very good idea to take one of the books. History of Man's a really good one to start with. Mike Rinder and I did a video about this. He said to me, I said, I read it. I said, I haven't read a Scientology book for 40 years, Mike. I read it. He said, you read it? It's like, oh, okay, I wasn't meant to read. And it's just gruesome nonsense. The Grim Weeper, the Boo-hoo, the Piltdown Man. So go back and break the spell, if you like, because we all need to do that so that we don't just carry on behaving that way. Our freedom of mind was compromised. And as Steve Hassan says, if you'd been brainwashed, how would you know you'd been brainwashed? And that presumption of invulnerability that we have is something that I think has to be dealt with. And as activists, I think it's really important that we ourselves seek to be healed, that we, seek to be virtuous people and worked out in our own minds, and hate and despise Scientology, the doctrine, the dogma put forward by Hubbard, but have the highest possible regard for those affected by it. I have trouble with David Miscavige on that one, but I like to say that as long as he didn't shout at me, I would have a conversation with him.
Yeah, I think this is the thing that I try and approach everything with, is the compassion. It took, firstly, just on what you're saying about the long-term effects, it took me almost 10 years of being out of Scientology before I realized that I wasn't believing in Scientology, but I was still applying Scientology techniques in my life without realizing. And that's when I started looking at, okay, how deep does this stuff go in my mind? And that's when I started unpacking it all and doing the whole recovery or healing or whatever you want to call it.
If only you'd had my phone number, I could have saved you 10 years. It's really awful that the material is out there to help people. Jesse Prince said that he'd had a copy of Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky for 6 years before he dared open the cover. And he then said, everybody should read this book 3 times. If you want to get over Scientology, there's enough information in here. Well, there's a lot of information in there, but there's more to it. I wrote a dozen papers, which I'd published by the early 90s, Possible Origins for Dianetics and Scientology, Hubbard and Magic, various things that Never Believe a Hypnotist, Hubbard talking about hypnotism. And I wish I could persuade anybody who's been in Scientology to go through this material first, because that's what it was meant for. It was meant to help people, wake up from it. I was really lucky. I had 9 years in. I did 5 OT levels. I was a class 2 auditor, and did the data series evaluators course and all of this stuff. And because I was treated as a celebrity, because I was a writer, artist, musician, kid gloves. I didn't know about the Rehabilitation Project Force and rice and beans diets. And when I did find out, it was enough to cause a break with me, where I said, I must not believe this anymore. I have to stop. Hubbard was a liar. He said honesty is sanity. By his own definition, he was insane because he contradicts himself. Dianetics was not based on hypnotism. Dianetics was based on hypnotism. Crippled and blinded at the end of World War II, I had no war wounds. All of this. So I realized he was a liar. And that was, for me, I said, I'm putting it all down, and I'll re-include it piecemeal if I find it useful. And 40 years later, I've never once desired to pick up the cans again. It's just... And the further you get away from it, the more embarrassed you become that you believed any of it. Does amount to a certain degree of humility. I sat with a Baptist minister once, churches together in East. The Catholic wouldn't be in the same room as the Baptists, so it's kind of churches done together. And the Baptists didn't mind being in the same room as the Catholic, but they knew he was the devil incarnate. So that made it a bit difficult. When I sat with the Baptists, and one says, how could you possibly, do these people really, do they really believe that Xenu went off to these plants and brought all these people and dropped them into volcanoes and blew them up with hydrogen bombs? And I looked at him and I couldn't help myself. I wasn't thinking. Sometimes I don't. And I said, there are people who believe there was a bloke who could not only walk on water, but turn it into wine. And he turned kind of beetroot red, which I'd never seen before. I'd heard about it. And I was, I'm so sorry. Of course, you're a Christian minister. I should have thought. But that sort of implacable, where was I sat there? I did OT3. I only did it for 3 days. I met a guy who'd spent 15 years doing it. 15 years. And by the time I met him, he's an old bloke by this time. Living in a rooming house, and what he's trying to do is to audit off the body thetans that made one of the women in the house smell. Mm-hmm. That was what his life had, he was an engineer in Australia and had a good career, and his life now was about trying to get rid of the smell of this woman by getting rid of the little body thetans that Hubbard had told him were attached to her. It's a route to crazy. It's a terrible, bad place.
Yeah, I think most Scientologists don't believe in Xenu because most Scientologists haven't got to the OT3 level. Like most Scientologists wouldn't agree with that whole Xenu story. And I think this is the thing, is most Scientologists, I believe, are genuinely good people. They are just unfortunately under the spell of this coercive group and organization that is Scientology, and they don't realize they are being manipulated. This is one thing I've talked a lot about. My job was sales, right? Regging. I was a bookseller, so my job was to recruit people into the org, get them to do a personality test, get them to buy a book, get them to start on their first life improvement course. And what I was doing in that role was manipulating people's emotions, because I had to find someone's ruin. We used to have a saying at London Org called "crying is buying," right? If I can get you to cry, you're buying the book, because I found out what's most traumatizing for you and re-stimulated it, right? And got you to be at effect rather than at cause. And so because
fear of worsening.
Yeah, exactly. And because of that, it's really easy to present Dianetics or the life improvement course or whatever it was as the solution to that. And I genuinely believed that I was doing that because I was helping that person. In order for this person to be helped, they need to feel like this, or they need to go through this re-traumatization. And ultimately, greatest good for the greatest number of dynamics, I'm helping them. But actually, now I'm out, I look back at that and I realize, no, that was wrong. That's a horrible thing to do to a person. And I wasn't helping them. Actually, I was probably doing some sort of damage to their mental health. And if they did sign up, even more so, because then they became a Scientologist. So I thought I was helping, but I wasn't. I was actually harming. And I think that is true for every Scientologist on the
Yes.
planet, is that they think they're helping. They are good people generally. That's not to say that there aren't bad people in Scientology. Of course, there were Danny Marston, Dave Miscavige. There are countless examples of people who are predators and abusers and so on. But most people just think that they're doing the right thing. And I try and remind myself of that when I'm standing on the street, you know, protesting outside the IES event or speaking to the press or speaking to a politician or whatever it is that I'm doing as an activist, is try and get that message of compassion across and say, hey, you can believe in what you want. I don't care. The main thing is, if you choose to leave, if you're questioning, if you're unhappy, if you want to find out what life is like outside of Scientology, there's a community of people here to support you. And there are organizations and groups that are there to help, and books you can read, and people that do genuinely care about you. And that's all. I just want you to know that we care about you. People do care about you. And that's the most important thing. You can choose to take it or leave it. But that compassion is really at the forefront of everything that I try and do anyway.
I mean, compassion and humility are the most important attributes of humanity, and I seek to be compassionate, and I have looked up the word humility, so you know I'm headed towards it a little bit. What you say is true. I'd been in Scientology for 7 years before I opened the OT3 pack and went, oh no, and that was my reaction. But it's also true to say that from the very beginning, you're being presented with nonsense. And you can reach down a copy of History of Man or Scientology 8008 or Scientology 880 or and on and on and on. And what comes out in these things, you know, having now spent 50 years involved with this whole thing, it's ludicrous nonsense. And we wanted to believe it. What you say about the manipulation, it's fascinating that, you know, I did the dissemination drill, of course I did, and I refused to apply it because I went, this is unethical. Right at the start, I was 19 years old, and went, no, I'm not going to bring anybody's tone level down ever, you know, even though I did pass the class 0 course, because that's manipulative. But then realizing that the way it's sugar coated, so you are in the upper indoctrination training routines. That's one of processing and indoctrination. They're my two favorite Hubbard terms, because he tells you what he's doing.
Yeah.
But in the upper indoctrination, you've got this idea that you are controlling the person's reactive mind to show the person that their reactive mind can be controlled. Now, with our views of coercion having developed over the years, the idea of grabbing hold of somebody and marching them over to a wall is no longer socially acceptable. That's something that's changed in the last 30 or 40 years. And so we have this thing of controlling people, and you're kind of going, hang about, Scientology is about controlling people. Yes, Scientology is about controlling people. When Hubbard talks about selling, in my little booklet, wherever it's gone, a copy of it somewhere down there, I'm sure. I put together what I consider to be the vital documents about Scientology in a booklet. Looks around feverishly and frantically in a booklet called Scientology: The Cult of Greed, and in there are a couple of pages on hard selling, and just looking at the raw material on that, what registrars were given to read, to say, you know, oh, people are usually in a hypnotic state of trance anyway, and you demand that the person buy, and you don't want Mrs. Patty Cake walking out on you. That right from the start, you are weaponized. You're turned into somebody who is meant to be controlling other people. You know, so the whole agonized future of every man, woman, and child on this planet will be involved with Scientology one way or another. It will be agonized too if it is. That there is this awful undertow all the time about making money and getting people to do things. And there is kind of Steve Hassan's influence continuum, that the further away you are from the center of that, less you know. So the celebrities who are at the far extreme of it probably don't have much of an idea of the day-to-day life of a Sea Organization member. I interviewed a woman who worked for Miscavige. I've interviewed quite a number of people who worked for Miscavige, but this particular woman worked at Golden Era, where she was an illustrator. And she'd been involved for 20 years. She'd been in the Sea Organization. And she told me that she slept 2 hours a night, that a really good night's sleep was 5 hours. Now, on a physiological basis, you're destroying the person by doing that to them. We cannot live. This is, we're kind of going, these are labor camps. These are concentration camps where these people are being held. And you have this awful problem that they've been brought to believe that what they're doing is good for them and good for humanity. They've promised to follow and uphold command intention for 1,000 million years, and thus give up their self-determinism for 1,000 million years to do whatever it was Ron wanted. And Ron's gone. You know, he wasn't going to give up that much time. He was going to have 40 years, and that's your lot. So we find ourselves in this bizarre situation where we have an intensely right-wing, anti-democratic organization that has slaves that it's keeping in enclaves all over the world, and governments are doing nothing. And that's probably a good place for us to wind up, that we now have, you know, and very much because of your efforts. Yeah. This is, you know, this is important. You went to Diane Abbott and it stimulated her into action, and you're providing her with the right materials, and John Sweeney with the right materials to do something about that. So let me applaud that as the final one.
Well, thank you, but it's a group effort, right? I couldn't do this without the help of many others. You know, there have been people who've been doing this for decades, including yourself, before I even came onto the scene.
I think I'm the only one who's left of my generation.
But I mean, that's what I mean is, you know, there's been a long road leading up to the point where I've been able to come out of Scientology and speak out, and then start being an activist and feel relatively safe in doing so. So firstly, applause back to you and everyone else for that. But also in the kind of present time, to use a Scientology term, is I've got a whole group of people supporting me in this mission. It's not just me. You know, when I had the whole debacle with East Grinstead Town Council recently, you very kindly, you know, emailed the mayor and offered your book and tried to help in that aspect. And, you know, there are other people as well behind the scenes who are helping. It's not just me. You know, it's a team effort. And the more we work together and collaborate, the better, I think. And I'm very much kind of poking in the dark and doing what I think is right and going in the direction I think is the most effective way. But I can't do it without everyone else. And sometimes, you know, I get it wrong. Sometimes I get it right. And who knows what will happen next? But I think right now we're in a position where it's highly likely Diane Abbott will be successful and have a very senior role in the next government. John Sweeney, who knows whether he'll be successful or not, but either way, we have two prominent political figures in the UK now publicly talking about Scientology, and we have an election just around the corner. I think that is an opportunity, and quite an enormous opportunity, to get this whole issue of abuse in Scientology onto the table as a nationally important issue. Because if we don't, it will just continue. It has continued since 1959. And if something isn't done about it, it will just keep going on and people will continue to be abused. And so if I've got a small window of opportunity to do something, I'm going to take it.
Good for you. And whoever, you know, everybody watching and listening, email your representative, your political representative, and say you would like an investigation into Scientology. Enough pressure will make something happen. Politicians, when they realize that lots of people are bothered about something, also realize that being re-elected depends upon doing something about it. I may be sounding a bit cynical here about politicians. I am. But, you know, with the next set of midterms in the US, the presidential election, elections here, this is a very good moment to say, I'm worried about Scientology. What are you doing about it? Go and see what Alex Barnes-Ross has to say.
And not just your representative, write to the people who are standing as candidates in your area as well.
Yeah.
Even because this is the thing, it's an apolitical issue. It's not something that should be left versus right. It is something that all politicians across the spectrum should be getting involved in and should have a say in. So regardless of whether you're in a Tory safe seat or a Labour safe seat, or whether you're in America and you're a Republican, write to the Democrats, write to the other side, write to everybody who's standing in your area and say, hey, you're standing as a candidate. What do you think about this? If you're successful, what are you going to do? Because the issue isn't about who's going to be elected. It's about who's willing to take a stand. And if there's someone who's definitely going to win in a Labour safe seat, but every one of his or her opponents are saying something about Scientology, that's going to force that person to make a statement about Scientology, even if they weren't originally going to. So write to everybody standing in your area and just ask for their thoughts on it and ask what they would do.
Yeah, very good point indeed. Well, thank you very much. I'm sure we will meet again. And this has been a great pleasure. Thanks a lot, Alex.
Thank you, John.